Well, for some analysis, we are joined in studio by Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg's Department of Sociology. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you on the programme.
Thanks for having me back here, yeah.
All right, SADC, they meet, they have these conversations about burning issues, and security has the International Relations Minister quite concerned with our troops being part of this UN force, and we've seen the discontent by the locals about this force. What should we be doing in South Africa?
Maybe we just step back. I mean, you're absolutely right, Peter, that in two places where we have 1,000 SANDF troops plus other regional troops, one the DRC, MONUSCO, but the other SAMIM, which is a Southern African mission in Mozambique on Cabo Delgado. Now in both places it's a similar underlying tension, which is a resource curse, where there's very enormous amounts of mineral wealth on the one side and Mozambique gas, and it just strikes me that until we sort out those, then there's going to be extraordinary conflict, turf wars, to some extent inherited ethnic battles, especially on the east side of the DRC. And I'd say, the South African troops aren't doing that well. They haven't performed particularly well, and we saw that already 9 years ago in the next door, Central African Republic, where in defending Francois Bozizé's regime and also defending South African businesses in Bangui, the capital, the Battle of Bangui was lost, and about 15 troops came home in coffins. And those experiences don't yet seem to have shaken our government, our commentariat, into thinking, what's this all about? Are these resources that we really need to put our troops in on behalf of usually Western, sometimes Eastern, Chinese capital, Indian capital, and in the case of Mozambique, it's gas, methane gas, that could also be extremely destructive for the climate. So deep-rooted questions first before we say, well, what should happen?
All right, so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that our leaders are focused on the symptoms instead of the root causes of the problem.
And that means, of course, that there will be insurgencies, Islamic-based but quite popular insurgency, in the sense that people are very angry in northern Mozambique about the lack of redistribution from big $20 billion, the single biggest investment in Africa, LNG, a liquefied natural gas facility by French-based Total, and then ExxonMobil, and then Eni from Italy, and China National Petroleum, and maybe Sasol, because they want to get the gas into the grid here. And in the DRC, we've also had South African firms. I can remember back to 2005, Anglo-American was mining and collaborating with warlords, and it was very embarrassing. And the leader of Anglo at the time, Bobby Godsell, actually had, after Human Rights Watch criticized them, had to actually review, because 5 million people had just been killed over, again, the turf on the eastern DRC, with all the gold and diamonds and copper and oil up there. Even Kulubusi Zuma, the nephew of the former president, at one point was given a 150 billion rand oil concession under Lake Albert. So you can just see how much is at stake, and hence when our troops go there, are they really working with the interests of the masses of people to keep them safe, or on behalf of these businesses? And that's where a little muddiness and a lot of anger come out.
So are we saying that had we not had these resources, we might be enjoying much more security?
Well, you can just think about all the sites around the continent, like Nigeria, where the looting of the oil in the Niger Delta led to a non-violent movement led by Ken Saro-Wiwa against Shell and a few others, but Shell was a particular target. Very, very messy company there. And because Saro-Wiwa was executed with 8 of his colleagues, then came the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, a military group that was kidnapping, just as a sort of popular response. And likewise, then, when they had a deal, but it didn't solve the problems, then came the Niger Delta Avengers. So I think until you get right to the root, I think of, say, eastern Zimbabwe, the greatest diamond field in modern history, and of course 800 miners, according to the local experts, artisanal miners were killed by the army in 2008. So that a Chinese consortium could come in and work with the generals, including then Defense Minister Emerson Mnangagwa. And as President Mugabe said, well, we had $15 billion worth of diamonds, but we only found $2 billion of revenue in our books. So 13 went away. And it's that resource looting, I think, Peter, that if we could get some way to stop that, which means going to the root cause, that is the looting of the continent's natural wealth, and of course its people, originally with slavery. And those are the sort of origin stories of conflicts of this sort, it strikes me.
DRC is particularly complicated because it has so many borders, and that means it's a cross-border problem. How does SADC navigate its way through all of these transnational interests?
Well, because DRC was actually put into SADC as it expanded from the Southern African Development Coordinating Community in 1980 to 94, democratization of South Africa, and DRC was brought in. But Rwanda and Uganda, Burundi are not in, and that's where, of course, those cross-border tensions are, ethnic tensions, residual colonial boundaries from 1885 in Berlin. All of these things make it not just a SADC problem, but an AU problem. However, we don't really see the leadership there, do we? We haven't found ways to say, address these crises. And one of the cross-border problems we're going to have more and more is climate refugees. And I'm glad SADC has put climate as a major problem, because they need to have adaptation, resilience, or climate proofing. And I think President Ramaphosa will probably go, remembering his visit on April 14 this year to KZN, 500 people killed, massive damage done without proper stormwater drainage, without decently well-built houses, without proper planning in a city like Durban even. And that will be also on the agenda, because cross-border migrancy, because of the climate crisis, the cyclones that wipe out so many places for people to live, well, they may come to South Africa, and we know the xenophobia in the society is at a peak, and we're really not ready to, even though South Africa did more of the climate damage than anyone else in Africa, we're not yet ready to take responsibility, are we?
Well, let's talk about climate change a little bit more then, because one wonders what a coordinated response might be, because climate change doesn't know borders. It just sweeps across regions, sweeps across the world. How should SADC, the AU, the continent be tackling this climate change issue?
Well, there is one big emitter, and that's South Africa, and so there's a sort of bribe out there, which I think is appropriate in some ways. It's the $8.5 billion we keep hearing about that Andre de Ruyter, the ESCOM leader, went to Glasgow to get, and now President Ramaphosa has appointed an experienced banker, Daniel Minelli. The question, though, is do they have the ways to get those funds really where they should go, to the victims, say, in Durban, who, as you probably see, are still unhoused. They built a few hundred houses, but something like 12,000 were really badly damaged. So let's say that the loss and damage, the phrase used in the UN, is not yet there for the damage. Let's call it a sort of part of a reparations that the global north, maybe myself as well here in Johannesburg, we owe to those victims. And that would be loss and damage. The people's lives are lost, impossible to compensate, but as we see with Marikana, there's some move to say, well, you've lost lives, you need to be paid. The second is adaptation and resilience. That's what they're working on tomorrow and the next day. The third is interesting. It's what the $8.5 billion partly pays for. It's to leave resources like coal in Mpumalanga underground and don't extract them. That's what the bribe is. And I think that's appropriate. I think some countries and areas like Mpumalanga should be paid to leave their fossil fuels underground. I would add that Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, the people there should be paid, and Total and ExxonMobil and Eni and China National Petroleum shouldn't extract from the largest gas field in the world. Otherwise, climate catastrophe. And it's that trick that they're going to have to work on, which is to take let's say the pilot of 8.5 billion, the North kind of knows it was US, UK, Germany, France, and the EU that made that concessional finance offer. And then to say, well, you need that in Zimbabwe for the coal in Wankie, and for Botswana, you have 220 billion tons of coal. You need to leave that underground. But then the North must compensate, as I say, in this third respect, for not taking the environmental space that the North's already taken. They need compensation for not extracting and not polluting.
adaptation means a new way of life. What do you do in a country like Zambia, where only 31% of the country has access to electricity, which means a lot of trees are being chopped down just to survive?
That's right. And the solar systems that could come in require major subsidies. And again, it would be up to the SADC group to say, okay, are we ready to go as the AU to Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt? Now that's the next Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in November. So now there's a few months to prepare and say, as a united front. Now, I've only seen that once, to be frank. That was Barcelona in 2009, just before the big Copenhagen summit. And the African delegations all walked out in unity. And the reason they did is because they couldn't get that issue of climate debt, the reparations, onto the agenda through just persuasion. They actually had to say, well, we will delegitimize, we're going to walk out. And outside you had protesters, let me call them tree shakers. And then inside you had some jam makers. So they began to get a few concessions. I think that's the big debate that we'll see in Sharm el-Sheikh. Do the African delegates go there with the militancy, and the moral righteousness that is deserved after Mozambique had these 2 cyclones and ranks the 4th hardest hit country in the world these last 20 years. If we had droughts here, we've had in the Horn of Africa, the locusts, the droughts, the flooding in the west. We've just had so many natural disasters that are actually climate related. It is time for these delegates to say, you in the north, you pay your climate debt.
All right, let's finish off going back to Kinshasa. What can come out of this meeting? Because they're often quite short, and yeah, there's delegations that meet beforehand. But as a citizen, I never feel like much has moved forward from summit to summit.
I think that's absolutely right, because this is a sort of elite group, and they are often negotiating imbalance in power. South Africa is obviously the most powerful. The big topic for the last year and a half has been whether a SADC army can go to northern Mozambique and sort it out. They haven't succeeded. They have some strong Rwandan troops, but frankly the guerrilla attacks are continuing, and they're still in the vicinity of the big LNG field. I think what, as a result, they should do is rethink the strategy and say, we're not winning by serving Western capital like Total or the mining houses in the DRC. Instead, what we should do is look at the roots of these problems and find ways to empower the areas, the citizenries, with the resources that they need. And it could well be solar electricity for Zambia, or for all of us, really. Those would be the sorts of deals, I think, that could be asked for from the global north at a time of such extreme inequality, the vaccine apartheid, the war in Ukraine and Iraq, the energy crises, the food crises. It's time to make the North cough up a little bit because of the damage it's doing.
All right. Well, we know what to do. Let's hope there's a political will to do it. Prof. Bond, it's always good talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you. All right, now, representatives of the Southern African Development Community have called for concerted efforts to enhance women's participation in politics and governance in the region. The call was made at the 42nd summit of the regional bloc in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chris Ochamringa is our correspondent in Kinshasa.
Delegates from the Southern African Development Community deliberate on the progress made in attaining gender equality in the region. They called on leaders from the 16-nation trade bloc to remove barriers that prevent women from participating fully in political affairs.
For us to have gender parity in politics, there has to be a vigorous effort from our leaders to create a conducive environment that should educate our people and ensure that women are not left behind.
A recent study conducted by the regional bloc shows that South Africa, Namibia, and Mozambique have the largest number of women representatives in parliament. The DRC, Eswatini, and Botswana have the least.
There are so many issues that hinder women from participating. Cyberbullying as one of them, violence, and also even in terms of resources, especially countries that do not fund, party politics and party participation in elections.
Women in the DRC have experienced that for decades. In 1987, Congolese lawmakers passed a law that prohibited women from getting jobs or opening bank accounts without getting permission from their husbands. The law was revised in 2016, but many women are still discriminated against.
SADC inapana hiyo makatiba, inapana hiyo madocument.
SADC has several protocols and legal frameworks on gender equality, but it does not have mechanisms that compel member states to apply them. That is where the problem is. We will keep holding meetings in Tanzania, Zambia and other countries, but won't make much progress.
The organizers of the SADC summit have a goal of making strides in attaining equal participation of women in leadership by 2030. Discrimination against women in the workforce is still common in some of the member states of the Southern African Development Community, despite the existence of laws and protocols. Authorities have urged member states to do much more to reduce the inequalities between women and men in the regional bloc. Chris Sochamringa, SABC News, Kinshasa.